Hi guys, hope your break is going well. This is the lecture for Chapter 24, titled Industry Comes of Age 1865 to 1900. This chapter will be dealing with industrialization, the rise of the Gilded Age, the laissez-faire movements of the time period. We'll see that Chapter 24 and the industrialization will lead to urbanization in Chapter 25, and that's where your next chapter is going to be leading us towards. All of the things I've just said so far are contextualizations or big trends or movements that can be used to categorize all the facts you're learning about inside your chapter. So the way that we do this lecture is two-part. Number one, I've got a documentary that I'll be showing to you guys that'll be interspersing through your online lecture. This documentary is titled The American Industrial Revolution. It is inside your materials for Chapter 24. So if you look inside of your American Pageant materials, you'll find this video there if you want to watch it in its entirety. I'll be showing it to you, though, as part of your lecture today. So I'll show you snippets that deal with elements you see inside your textbook, and then I'll jump in with the lecture to highlight what stuff from your textbook you want to be looking into as you study. So let's get you guys started with that first. And like I mentioned, I'll be then jumping in to try to help you guys out with the rest of your lecture. As you guys are working your way through, also keep in mind that any questions or problems you have are totally legitimate, and so feel free to email or else save them until Monday, and then we'll be able to look over those issues and be able to discuss them when you guys come back. Our test will be on Tuesday when we come back from break, and so you'll have some time to be able to address it then. So let's get started with your documentary and your lecture.
The Civil War marked a great turning point in America's history. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the country was transformed. The Civil War marked a great turning point in America's history. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the country was transformed from a rural republic to an urban state. Frontiers vanished in the face of westward expansion. Factories and steel mills appeared on the scene, fueled by immigrant labor streaming through Ellis Island. Great transcontinental railroad lines linked the country together like never before. But with these advances came the evils of poverty and overcrowding. Poor working conditions and labor unrest marred the workplace, and the growing output of factories for the first time threatened the environment. It was in this setting that America came of age, poised on the brink of a revolution, the American Industrial Revolution. In 1870, America was a geographically isolated country. During the last 3 decades of the 19th century, Americans occupied a much larger portion of the country's land than during the 3 previous centuries. The saturation of railways was key to this important geographic change. Prior to 1865, railways did not reach west of the Mississippi River. Although Congress had approved the building of a transcontinental railroad in 1850, the North and South delayed construction with disputes concerning route access. After the Southern states seceded from the Union in 1861, the North gained control of the project, securing a central route. Shortly thereafter, Congress authorized the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads to build lines meeting each other in Sacramento and Omaha. The Union Pacific workforce included Irish immigrants, Civil War soldiers, and Southern African Americans. From the west, Chinese laborers of the Central Pacific Railway set out to meet them from California. In May of 1869, the 2 railways met at Promontory Point, Utah, where leaflets and banners invited Americans to ride all the way to San Francisco. When Chief Engineers Samuel Montague and Grenville Dodge shook hands, the moment marked the opening of the way to the West. The economic consequence of the railroads was immeasurable. When engine power moved from wood to coal, the demand for coal tripled. When rails moved beyond iron to steel, the modern steel industry evolved. Many other industries emerged as well. Notably, the refrigerated freight car, developed in partnership with Gustav Swift, gave birth to the meatpacking industry. And the grain, lumber, and steel industries virtually exploded as new railways transported huge resources to towns, cities, and ports across the country. The growth of the railroad was astounding. In 1870, there were 57,000 miles of railroad track in the continental U.S. By 1890, this figure had grown to nearly 167,000 miles. Innovations in the railroad network, such as the air brake and sleeping cars, made rail travel smoother, safer, and more comfortable. But the most dramatic change in the railroads was spurred on by something new.
So when you think about the time period that we're discussing of the late 1800s, the railroad is going to be your key to transportation developments that are going to cause the rise of industry. And the reason why is because it's going to have a huge revolutionary impact on all different elements of society. When you look at the railroads, first thing that I want you to be thinking about is, number one, these railroads were in existence before we got to the Civil War. But the thing that changed is they're going to explode after the Civil War, and they're going to go national. And the reason why they're going to go national is because Abraham Lincoln's going to realize during the Civil War that there's a problem. We've got all these different widths of train tracks up in the north because they've been privately built. He's going to, during the Civil War, set a standard gauge for how wide trains need to be, and that's going to create a universal train width for the United States. So going from East Coast to West Coast will get a lot easier from 1865 on. Transcontinental Railroad, though, is going to have problems with it, and the problem that it's going to have is that these are really expensive things to build. Businesses don't want to take on the risks themselves because of the fact that this is such a dangerous sort of thing where they could easily go bankrupt. And so the business of railroads are going to try to work with the government to try to get subsidies to pay for their construction. Now, during the Civil War, this was less of an issue because the government was willing to pay for railroad construction since they needed it as a strategic thing for the war. After the war was done, though, the government still wanted to maintain the railroads and expand them because they wanted to get people out west quickly to make America grow as fast as they possibly can. The greater the growth, the more markets they could then create, the more natural resources they could have, the more wealth we could have, and then we could have more control over the country as a result. So what we're going to see is inside the United States, there's going to be a railroad building boom. And unlike the rest of Europe, where in Europe, when they build trains, it's to connect together two cities that are already established because they don't have the open spaces that America does. America's going to start building trains to nowhere, where they're just going to start building out west with the hope that they can entice then farmers or ranchers or miners or lumberjacks to take advantage. So we're going to see that the number of railroad tracks inside the United States is going to outpace all of what Europe has by the time we get to 1889. And so this is going to give America a huge competitive advantage. We're going to find then inside the United States, there's going to be a lot of motivation for the government and large businesses to work together. Now, what I want you to consider is inside of our country, we've had a mentality that for the government, there's been a concern that the government should not be getting too involved with things like welfare, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other sorts of programs that might make the people dependent on the government. Many of the people who are making those arguments are large business owners of the late 1800s who are going to create ideas like social Darwinism to explain why they believe that the government should allow the people to either rise or fall on their own. The problem with that sort of mentality is we're going to find that the largest bailouts being given in the late 1800s are to businesses, most notably railroads. And what's going to happen is the railroads are going to get paid with both cash and land grants. And with the land grants, what the railroads are going to do is they're going to do it in a sketchy sort of fashion where instead of taking chunks of land all in one stretch, they're going to break them up into a checkerboard pattern. So they're going to have half of the land that they're going to be getting on one side of the train track, half the land on the other side of the train tracks, and it's going to be an alternating sort of checkerboard pattern. So in between, there'll be little chunks of land that are going to be left for private purchasing, but essentially, since they're out in the middle of nowhere along the train track, the railroad's going to be able to control those as well. So they're going to figure out a scheme to be able to get a lot of land set aside for themselves. Now, for the government, they're going to get benefits. They'll be able to move their mail around easily. They'll be able to move their military around. They'll be able to move people and materials around. So this is going to help the economy boom. But the problem that we're going to see then is the scandals and the corruption that you've seen so far. And then also that governmental influence inside of business is going to make government and business very tight with one another to the point where the workers are going to have a really hard time trying to force any sort of changes because the government and the businesses have formed such a tight alliance with one another. As we take a look at the railroads then, what the railroads will be up to is that they're going to be selling land to people out west who want to purchase it. We're going to look at these railroads, though, as things that will help the West boom, but it's also going to lead to a number of crashes. And so we're going to crash every single time that we get to a 3 in the late 1800s. 1873, 83, 93. You'll want to remember the rule of threes with crashes in the late 1800s. Because the railroads will build out west, they'll over-speculate, and then eventually there'll be a crash that comes afterwards when there's a correction that takes place. The other thing I wanted to notice is that this boom and bust cycle is going to create an awful lot of winning and losing in the late 1800s. Like, you're going to find that the railroads building out west will create boom towns and ghost towns, depending on where the railroad ends up going. You're going to see that as railroads start crashing, less and less diversity will happen with ownership, and you're going to find that there's a number of people who shrink the ownership base, so only a few people will own all the railroads by 1900. And we're going to find that there's going to be these corruptions that are going to be happening throughout the system as people are starting to move out west with these railroads. Now here's your checkerboard pattern that I was describing for you, where the railroads are going to claim all of these red areas, and the green areas, while they're technically not the railroad's ownership, they're so cemented into these areas owned by the railroads that essentially on either side of the railroad tracks by 1 mile, the railroads own everything going out west of here. So this is very lucrative, but it's also very risky. And every decade or so, we end up crashing out pretty hard and the railroads start struggling. So in 1862, this is where our transcontinental railroad is going to be getting started. Notice the two train companies that are building. Union Pacific is going from east to west, and they're going to be given the opportunity to connect up with the Pacific, Union Pacific and the Central Pacific are going to be two railroad companies that you want to be discussing. Central Pacific going from west to east, Union Pacific going from east to west. As they're building out west, these guys are getting paid massive amounts of money and land, and they're also being encouraged to do things that are corrupt. Like, they'll sometimes create train tracks that weave back and forth because they're getting paid by the mile rather than just to build the railroad itself efficiently. And so sometimes they do inefficient things to make as much money as they can. You've also learned about the credit mobilier, where you've got scandals going on, like this situation where the Union Pacific hired another company to double bill the government, and they bribed congressmen to not make much noise about this. You're going to also find that construction during this time period is going to be such where these workers are very much finding themselves not in a situation where they're being protected by their business owners, even though the business owners are claiming that they're the best in our society who will take care of the workers because they're better. Instead, what they're doing is they're hiring the lowest of the low, going from east to west. There are a lot of Irish people being hired because of the fact that people don't like Irish people. And so you're going to have a nativism and a racism that's going on with these guys to be able to use these workers in a very dangerous sort of work environment. We're going to find the Central Pacific is being built from west to east. The most famous name that you'll want to notice is Leland Stanford. So you're going to find that a lot of these large monopoly owners are going to become very much philanthropic. And so Leland Stanford is the guy who created Stanford University out in California, one of our leading colleges of the West Coast. Vanderbilt University is going to be named after Cornelius Vanderbilt, another railroad tycoon. So be looking for that as you're working your way through. But these guys are working from west to east, and they're going to be using Chinese workers that they bring in with the mentality that since the Chinese were able to build the Great Wall of China, they should be able to build the railroads here. Now, what we'll see with the Chinese that are brought in, there is a deliberate effort to bring in only men, because many of the railroad builders feel like there was a mistake made with slavery by bringing in men, women, and children. You then had a population that could grow on itself. There was a feeling that the Chinese men would come here, work to build the railroad, they would die childless, and then you would have the benefits of essentially slave labor with Chinese, but without the lasting then population that outlasts the work that they're doing. So we're going to see the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific will move towards each other, and in 1869 they're going to unite. And this is going to create a huge nationalistic feeling inside the United States. The idea that America could build a train track from east to west coast in less than a decade through hostile Native American territory, through the Rocky Mountains, through the Great American Desert, out west of the Mississippi River. It's a huge accomplishment for them, and it leads a lot of Americans to believe that they are then a special group of people to be able to have pulled this off. Ignoring the fact that it wasn't the nativistic Americans who did it, it was the Chinese and the Irish workers who largely are getting that done. That's usually swept to the side as something that's ignored in this process. For your railroad, though, what's going to happen is now your West Coast and your East Coast is tied together, and you've now got the potential of East to West Coast trade, where you could have a boat go from Europe to the East Coast, to railroad across the United States, to the West Coast, off across the Pacific, and you can then trade with Asia. So essentially, they can accomplish what they were hoping to do when Columbus arrived. They're able to do that centuries later by accomplishing this huge accomplishment. As the railroads are moving out west, you're going to see other railroads start moving out west too. And so we're going to have a Northern Pacific that's going to go from up around Duluth out west. You're going to have the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe going through the Southwest. And then there's the Southern Pacific that we want to notice. But most importantly, we want to notice the Great Northern when it comes to Minnesota, because the Great Northern is the Minnesota connection to what you see going on with the monopolies. It's also very famous because James J. Hill has a gigantic mansion over in St. Paul that some of you may have toured on a field trip. He also is going to build his railroad with no money coming from the federal government. And so he prides himself on the idea that he's able to build this up without having to leech money out of the government like other business owners need to do. What we also want to notice with James J. Hill, though, is he is going to become the subject of the first effort to really crack down on monopolies when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. So in a few chapters, when we get to the end of January, you're going to see James J. Hill popping up again, and he's going to get attacked by Teddy Roosevelt for having a railroad monopoly that is seen as being too big. For your railroads, though, here's what I want you to be noticing. They're going to have massive bankruptcy issues. There's going to be huge mergers, massive reorganizations. Whenever we crash the economy, many of the railroads will then get into economic difficulty, and then as they start to collapse, a few rich monopoly owners will start buying up more and more of the railroads until eventually the railroads are owned by just a small circle of people who can then control them and do what they want with them. What we want to notice, though, is with the railroads, we're going to see that the western lines are now connecting to the older eastern networks, and the name that you want to notice is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt is known as the Commodore, so if you ever watch the Vanderbilt basketball team, their nickname is the Commodores, named after Vanderbilt, the founder of that university. And what Vanderbilt is known for is he starts off in water shipping. He is traveling overseas in shipping boats. That's why he gets the nickname Commodore. And then he decides to merge that system together with railroad lines, and that becomes all his monopoly. He is going to be working constantly to try to figure out how to make his monopoly bigger and stronger. He starts adding things like air brakes. The Westinghouse air brake gets invented during this time period that has a huge impact on increasing safety. He's going to be working with the Pullman Company to create palace cars where people can then sleep and relax as a form of vacation by traveling on the railroads. And so we're going to see that the railroads are going to be changing a lot through the late 1800s and transforming with new innovations regularly to try to take the railroad into different places than it's been before. But we're going to see that this is America's biggest industry by far. It's going to impact steel, it's going to impact oil, transportation, farming, and a whole host of other sorts of things. What you also want to notice is that for people around the world, they recognize how special this moment is. And so we got tons of money flying in from Europe to try to invest in these railroads and make money off of these investments. So we got money pouring in from outside the country because this is such a special sort of opportunity that's been booming. The key for you guys, though, is notice that you now are having another element of the market revolution where we've got two-way traffic where you don't need steamboats anymore. And so from this point forward, what I wanted to notice if you ever travel around the country, many cities that are started before the Civil War are situated on water. Think Minneapolis and St. Paul, because that's where your river boats are working. At this point, though, with the railroad, you no longer are tied to needing water anywhere near you to found a major city. So if you think about a place like Denver, Colorado, it doesn't have a major river route that's drawing people out there. Instead, the train is built. It allows people to move out in the area. And so we're going to see a change in settlement patterns, and then we're able to drive into a whole lot of parts of the country that haven't really been accessed all that well because the railroad can now reach to them. This is going to cause a boom in mining, agriculture, lumber, You're going to see this then creating raw resources that are going into the factories, and then all these guys need to buy stuff in a market approach from the factories so they can live in isolation out in the West. We're going to find, though, that out West, there's going to be this issue with going on with land, because we're going to find now that there's a radical transformation that takes place with the land. Farmers are going to radically change the way that the western frontier is going to be working, where we're going to harvest a lot more food, but we're also going to do some environmental damage that we're going to study, especially when we get to the Dust Bowl in the 1920s. We're going to see a huge impact on buffalo. Because of the fact that they're seen as a threat to trains. They can derail them. And they're also seen as sustaining Native Americans, and that's not seen as a pleasant thing for white settlers. Where you are living right now, this used to be part of a big white pine forest that extended all the way from down in Iowa all the way up to the northern frontier. And white pine was prized because it grows straight and it's easy to board it, cutting it into long boards that can be used for houses and fences and whatever. We largely cut that stuff down. And so the white pine largely gets wiped out in the area where you're living because they harvest so much of it for lumber production. For the railroad, then, what we're going to see is the change we discussed inside your class with the Steel Empire game. They're going to start creating time zones, like you saw on this map back here. The time zones are going to be an invention by the railroad companies themselves, so that they can designate for people what time is noon, so you can read a train schedule. Because previously, you just would go outside, look up, and whenever the sun was above your head, that would then be noon. So as we scan forward with your railroads, then, this is your big transformational event. This is going to be the thing that allows America to boom. It's going to allow our economy to take off. It causes a ton of changes, and it's going to create a lot of millionaires. You're going to have a lot of wealthy people who get rich off of this situation. Many of them, though, are engaged in stock speculation, where they are gambling on stocks, and this can create a boom and a bust cycle where, like I mentioned to you, we crash about every 10 years. In the late 1800s, some of that's accidental, and some of it is definitely deliberate. You also have railroad wreckers, where you've got some people who will engage in cutthroat competition, where they might build a railroad track right next to an existing train track to try to drive one of them into bankruptcy, so that then they can take over a route. You'll also have people who will do things to destroy the value of stocks, and other sorts of schemy sort of things. And the most famous of the people doing this is Jay Gould, who you've already met through his gold scheme when he was messing around with the monopoly on gold during the Grant presidency. But what he's going to do is he's going to engage in stuff that's going to be very much suckering in investors who are not in the know. And what he likes doing is something called stock watering. Stock watering is an idea that comes from the livestock days, where if you were trying to sell off your cows and make an extra buck, what you would do is you would feed your cows salty stuff, and then they would fill up with water right before they got weighed, and it would then over-exaggerate how heavy those cows were, getting you a better profit for your cows. What he would do is he would do stock watering with the stocks of railroads, and what he would do is he would do tricks to make the value of his stock go up, and he would work out this scheme so that the stock value would look better than it actually was. He would then con a bunch of people to buy into the stock, and then after people bought in the stock and bought the stock from him, he would then allow the price to drop, and all these suckers would then get stuck with stock that had been radically overinflated. Now, the question with stuff like that is what should then be done about that? Because when we look at what Jay Gould is doing, technically what he's doing is not illegal in the late 1800s, but it's not illegal less because it's immoral, but more because of laissez-faire. There's a decision being made by the government that they're not going to regulate on something like this. Part of the reason why the government's not regulating, though, is people like Jay Gould are heavily financing politicians, and so as a result, there's almost bribery taking place, but there's no quid pro quo. There's no actual deal saying, I give you this money, and then you create this bill to protect me. Instead, it's just all understood that this will all take place. So as a result, railroads are going to end up with monopolies. Railroads will be able to do things like jack up people's rates. They'll get into wage wars with their workers. They will get into battles with other railroads. And what we're going to find is many of these railroad owners do not really care about the people all that much, because when you start a business, you're starting a business to make money. And so we're going to find that with capitalism, these people are engaging in very much the rawest form of capitalism, where they're trying to figure out ways to make money and protect their business while also wiping out other business owners. What we're going to see, though, is in the late 1800s, This is going to look immoral to a lot of people. The idea that they're bribing judges and legislatures, they're using lobbyists who are going to the politicians, and they're very much schmoozing with them and sometimes bribing them. They're also helping to elect their own people into high offices inside the government, so they're almost acting like their own political machines, where instead of representing immigrants, they're representing big businesses. They're also going to give away free train passes to anybody who's influential. If you're journalists or politicians, you can travel pretty much anywhere in the United States for free, and then the assumption is that you're going to be nice to the railroad so you can keep getting that sweet deal. And so we're going to find that with these business owners, they're going to get huge amounts of power, and we're going to have people like Cornelius Vanderbilt right now, who is going to be very much carrying a lot of power with him. This cartoon is obviously very critical of that because you can see him holding the people hostage while he's just rolled up business people, workers, and also justice. And he's got his military right here, so if there's ever a strike, he's able to use them for that. One of his famous quotes is "The public be damned," where he was very much not worried about the public at large. He was more worried about business himself. Another monopoly owner at this time pointed out that with the riches that they had and the power that they had, he felt confident that they could hire one half of the poor people in the country to go out and kill the other half and still have money left over. And so for these guys, they have a very overinflated idea of what importance they have, and they're very much going to have sway. Now, when we look at this monopoly that's taking place, we're going to find that these business owners are going to have tons of power, where they're not going to be limited to these terms that they have. And so unlike the president who comes in, goes out, you'll notice we have presidents in the late 1800s, whether it's Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, they're all pretty weak. And it's largely because they don't have much power. Congress does, but Congress is very much being influenced by these guys. Many of these monopoly owners, though, come to the idea that they don't like the competition once they get a leg up, and they're going to try to figure out ways to build cartels or pools where they're going to divide up chunks of the country into their territory, and then they're going to work with one another to maintain the situation that they have. We're going to find that they're very much going to be greasing each other as well. So one of the tactics they like to use is rebates or kickbacks, where for like railroad companies, they need a lot of business on a regular weekly basis. And so what they're going to do is they'll work out deals. One of the most famous ones was with Rockefeller Oil, where railroad companies would give rebates to John D. Rockefeller, where if he sent massive shipments of oil on a regular basis through their railroads, he would get a lower rate on shipping his oil because he's shipping in bulk than farmers would, because farmers are only shipping in the fall. They're competing for limited spots on the trains. And so you'll find that John D. Rockefeller is paying less for his railroad usage than farmers will. It's easy to justify economically. For a lot of the farmers, though, they'll argue that John D. Rockefeller doesn't need a break, especially since every other decision that's happening in the government is very much meant to help out with the building of big business. So for the American people, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be very much focusing on the idea of trying to limit injustice, but that doesn't really extend to economic injustice. Many of the people inside the United States are fearful of ideas like anarchism, socialism, communism, and labor unions because they feel like they're un-American ideas. Instead, many Americans come to the belief that they are middle class, or because of the American work ethic and the American dream, they're destined to enter into the middle class. And so for many of these people, they are resistant to limit what's going on with businesses because they have the dreams of eventually getting to that spot. This is not very different than what you saw going on in the Deep South with slavery, where you had a bunch of white individuals in the South who did not own slaves, but they embraced the system of slavery with the idea that they could eventually achieve that level. But then also many of them believe what Jefferson said, where he was very hostile to the idea of the government getting involved in businesses and limiting them, where he was very much about strict constructionism. And this is something that's a legacy that's still held on through the late 1800s. And it still holds a lot of sway nowadays. You can see that with the debates that we have going on with like the Tea Party, the Affordable Care Act, and other sorts of decisions where many Americans are very hesitant to look at what I've just been describing as economic injustice, and they'll look at what I've just been describing as just being straight capitalism. And that's what we get to leave to you guys, is to make the determination, how do you feel about that? What I want you to notice, though, is in the late 1800s, there is now pressure to try to fix that. But these groups that are trying to fix this are different from one another. So we've already highlighted the farmers who are looking at radical ideas to reform our country. One of the things that they start doing is they start bringing court cases inside the Midwestern states and their legislatures. And one of the court cases is known as Munn versus Illinois. In Munn versus Illinois, it was decided in the Supreme Court that the state of Illinois could create laws limiting the ability of railroads to jack up rates on farmers when we got to the fall. Now, in Munn versus Illinois, then, what it says is each state can regulate railroads and monopolies if they're becoming abusive. About a decade later, though, we had what's known as the Wabash cases. And in the Wabash cases, you see the impact of the Gilded Age on our governmental structure. In the Supreme Court at this point is now a number of more conservative, laissez-faire people who are going to argue in the Wabash cases that it's not the state's job to regulate monopolies that are engaged in interstate commerce. It's up to the federal government to do that. The problem in 1886 is the president and Congress had no interest in engaging this sort of regulation. And so we're going to find that the farmers, the grangers, are going to get really angry because they're told they can't fix their problems. And then they're told that the federal government will not fix their problems. When they finally make the Sherman Antitrust Act, it's not going to have any sort of power to really do much because of the fact that there's not a lot of willpower behind it to make changes. So in the Sherman Antitrust Act, they're also going to create something called the Interstate Commerce Act. That's going to create the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. And what it's going to say is you can't do rebates if you're a railroad. You can't do pooling of ownership of businesses to try to limit competition. You have to lay your rates out openly. You can't discriminate between one shipper and another. You can't charge more for short-haul than long-haul lines. But what we're going to find is that in this law, there's enough loopholes that are built in that where all of this stuff sounds good, almost all of the stuff will continue after the law is created, even though they're going to say that it's illegal, because the president and government is not going to be interested in enforcing these laws very tightly. So for the ICC, this is a huge moment that I want to be noticing because this is the first moment that we see the creation of reforms that are meant to try to regulate businesses. We're going to find that while this one does very little to actually affect change, it's the thing that starts the momentum rolling, so that we're going to find in the early 1900s a group called the Progressives are going to start at this point and then start running forward with other changes that they want to put into effect. So what we're going to take a look at next then is after we've laid out for you the railroads and how they're booming, they have impacts on a growth of a bunch of different monopolies, and we'll be taking a look at each of them today as we work our way through. So we're going to be taking a look at the largest monopolies, especially Carnegie and Rockefeller, and the inventors like Edison, and then we'll be able to move back into your lecture.
For decades, steel had combined the strength of wrought iron with the durability of cast iron, but the costly process of extracting carbon from iron made it a luxury. Then, in 1859, Kentuckian William Kelly and Englishman Henry Bessemer, working independently, discovered a way to inject air into the molten metal, burning off enough carbon to render steel. Once this process was refined, steel became affordable and easy to produce. The steel race had begun. In 1870, 77,000 tons were produced each year. By 1900, that amount had skyrocketed to 11.4 million tons annually. Andrew Carnegie was the predominant steel baron of his time. Emigrating from Scotland at age 12, he went to work as a bobbin boy at a Pittsburgh textile mill. His wisdom in surrounding himself with highly talented lieutenants helped to put his competitors out of business. Carnegie once remarked that his epitaph should read, "Here lies the man who was able to surround himself with men far cleverer than himself." Carnegie realized the enormous potential for steel during a trip to Europe in 1872, and soon established a massive factory near Pittsburgh, the most modern of its day. Fed by iron ore from Lake Superior and coal and limestone mined in the east, Pittsburgh soon became the steel capital of the world. Carnegie sold his steel company to banker J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million. He retired with a guaranteed income of $1 million per month. Morgan congratulated him on being the richest man in the world. The company later combined with others to become the United States Steel Corporation, U.S. Steel. Another business that fueled the industrial expansion was oil. When Edwin L. Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, no one could foresee the impact that it would have on the nation. Initially, it was not of much use. Greasing wagon wheels and nostrums were all it seemed good for, until a Yale professor discovered that it could be refined into three important products: gasoline, kerosene, and a distillate used to form new substances. From 1860 to 1900, dozens of developers applied for patents as motor applications increased with demand. Some industrialists were wildly successful in exploiting this new market. Among them was a young man named John D. Rockefeller. Born to a New York peddler in 1839, Rockefeller went on to become the first oil billionaire. At age 16, John D. Rockefeller began working as a clerk in a produce company. While there, he formed a partnership in a grain commission. Rockefeller used those profits to enter into the oil business at 23 years of age. Rockefeller set out to make the fledgling oil industry efficient. His goal was to establish a centralized control system to curtail wild price variations and waste. 15 years later, the goal was reached when his Standard Oil Company of Ohio controlled the flow of oil products from producer to consumer. Rockefeller's companies had acquired crude oil fields, long-distance pipelines, and operated retail outlets. By 1880, Standard Oil owned the chief refineries in New York City, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. Ultimately, Rockefeller controlled 90% of the world's oil trade under the Standard Oil Trust, which comprised 41 companies. The trust was dissolved in 1892 by the Supreme Court for antitrust violations. Although railroads, steel, and oil were among the most influential industries of the late 19th century, they were not alone in their prosperity. Prior to the Civil War, the U.S. Patent Office issued less than 1,000 patents annually. By 1890, inventions were being registered at the rate of 25,000 each year. The invention of the typewriter, the adding machine, and the cash register sped the growth of business. George Eastman's Brownie camera, the elevator, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone all mark this new season of ingenuity. By 1900, Bell's phone had found its way into 1 million homes. But supreme among all inventors was Thomas Alva Edison. Among his many inventions, Edison was responsible for the phonograph, the mimeograph, the dictaphone, improved film projectors, storage batteries, and, of course, the light bulb. Thomas Edison didn't actually invent the light bulb, but he refined the filament, making it practical for everyday use. Along with his team of scientists, Edison is credited with producing a minor invention every 10 days and a major invention every 6 months. During his lifetime, Edison was granted an astonishing 1,093 patents.
So we've got a huge impact that's happening during the monopolies of the time period, where we're seeing this boom with the Industrial Revolution that's leading to a rise in output. Now, for the United States in 1860, around the Civil War, we're going to see that America was already an industrial power, but by 1894, they're going to surge to being number one, outranking England, France, all those countries. There's a few different reasons why this is taking place. In the late 1800s, you've got tensions and crises that are going on between European countries, and so that's causing issues where the United States is largely protected by the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Number two, there's a lot of money that's floating around inside the United States, both because of greenbacks during this era, silver money that they're using, but then also tons of money is flooding in from investors outside the country. We're going to find then that this is going to lead to the boom of millionaires in the late 1800s, and this is going to create then the opportunity for a lot of money to be made, especially if you're a business owner. And because of that, then there's going to be an impact happening inside of our government, because many people in the government are watching floods of money coming into our country. They're going to be very much investing in American companies, and they're going to allow Americans to run their businesses as they want to. And they're going to be able to do that without much government intervention. We're going to have laissez-faire economics taking place. With all that money flooding in, then, they've also got the opportunity to use that money to then give money to politicians. So we're going to see the bribery that we were describing earlier taking place. We're also going to have a country that has now connected together its industrial centers that are urbanized with our rural areas that can provide natural resources like coal, oil, iron, rich iron deposits that are going to find up in Minnesota in our Iron Range, other sorts of minerals, and then also all of that food that we're able to produce out in the farmland. You can now ship that into the cities so that the people don't need to be subsistence farmers where they're growing their own food. They're going to be able to buy food from the farmers themselves. Obviously, a big issue, though, is with this system. This system is then going to be set up in a way where you've got business owners and the government working with one another. For the poor people of this time period, though, they are very much going to be cheap, unskilled laborers. And because of the fact that there are waves of immigrants who are coming in, there's going to be the opportunity to drive down wages. And especially if you include a level of nativism into this process, you'll be able to then vilify these individuals. So if they do try to create labor unions or protest for wages or safety equipment or whatever, you'll be able to beat up on them pretty easily without a public outcry in their support. We're also going to see that we're moving closer and closer to our assembly line system that is going to be perfected by Henry Ford with his Model T. But we're going to be very much seeing that the businesses that are happening now are very much not like craftsmen's jobs, but instead you're there slapping a part onto a machine, and that's going to allow them to hire less and less skilled individuals. So in the late 1800s, we're going to see a massive increase in the number of patents and copyrights that are created. In America, we talked previously about how the idea of copyright, being able to register an invention with the government and get protection then from people stealing your ideas, becomes a huge element to allow our country to boom. In the late 1800s, we have inventors who swarm to America. Some of them are from outside the country, some of them internally, but they are incredibly inventive. And because of that, America becomes a hotbed of brand new inventions because of that legal standard where if you want to use their ideas, you then need to pay them royalties in return for being able to use the product of their imaginations. We're going to find that Thomas Edison is going to be the most notable of our inventors, although he is really good at building up public relations about himself to brag about the things that he's up to, even though he's using a group of people at his Menlo Park facility to invent stuff. He'll take credit for a lot of things that he was part contributor for or towards, or else he'll inflate his image. But he becomes the template for what a good American looks like, the type of person who can come from humble beginnings and invent his way to prosperity. So a lot of Americans are going to try to mimic what he was up to try to mimic his success. What we'll find then is that the business owners that we've just discussed, Carnegie with steel, Rockefeller with oil, Vanderbilt with railroads, they're going to all try to figure out ways to build up a business and then get themselves protections so that they don't lose the business they're building up. Some are coming from rich beginnings. Andrew Carnegie is coming from humble beginnings, and so he came over as a Scotch-Irish immigrant. He worked inside of a railroad company for a monopoly owner named Tom Scott, and he was most famous for being about your age when he got a job inside the railroad, and he was able to single-handedly reroute an entire train crash on the rails just because of the fact that he could decipher telegraph messages without writing them down. He would listen to two telegraphs. He was able to reroute all the train traffic around this one train crash, and he was then able to help keep the railroad running without a significant slowdown. When he did this, he was offered the opportunity to move up in the railroad company, but he made the decision that he wanted to move into the new business of mass-producing steel, where because of the Bessemer process, where they figure out a new way to refine massive amounts of steel, he wants to get involved in that, and what he's going to build is a vertical monopoly. So remember, a vertical monopoly is where you buy all the stuff that goes into your business, so he's going to buy the Iron Range in large chunks up in northern Minnesota. He's going to buy huge fleets of ships, huge numbers of railroads, and what he wants is he wants to be the only person to be handling the entire process So he doesn't need to pay anybody outside of his company for any of his raw materials, and that will then keep his costs low. So this vertical integration is going to be something that allows Carnegie to be able to mass produce steel at rates that are gigantically less than what they've been previously. But keep in mind that while it sounds great that Carnegie is doing what he's doing, Carnegie already had competitors outside the country, in England and other places. And the reason why those companies can't compete inside of our country is, remember what Carnegie and others have been doing to the government. They've been encouraging them to keep tariffs incredibly high. Tariffs went up during the Civil War to try to protect our little businesses created during the Civil War time. They're still around during this time period when we've got businesses that are absolutely ready to compete with other countries, but the business owners do not want to compete with other countries. They would prefer to maintain a closed market so that they could then have a monopoly themselves. And we're going to find that this is very much a bailout for big businesses so that they could then have artificial protections to be able to have their monopoly. John D. Rockefeller, on the other hand, has a monopoly on oil. And what he does not want is he does not want total vertical integration, because that would mean that he would own everything from the oil drilling operations through the production of his oil for the markets. And he's afraid of buying into oil wells that are being drilled, because a lot of them end up dry. So a lot of people spend a lot of money, they risk a lot of stuff to drill an oil rig. He instead wants to own all of the refineries that are taking crude oil and making it into something usable, so that he's the only one involved in that level. And if you try to compete with him, his business is going to get so big that even though everybody has the choice of who they want to sell oil to, eventually they'll only have one choice with Rockefeller's Standard Oil. So these are your monopolies that you're going to be seeing taking place. But when we see the idea of a trust is something that's going to be created by John D. Rockefeller to try to get around anti-monopoly laws that start coming onto the vogue into 1870. And so I'm going to draw that for you to show you what that looks like. So when you look at our monopolies of this time period, monopolies oftentimes in cartoons are represented as octopuses. So you'll oftentimes have your monopoly owner right here, and oftentimes they will have tentacles that come off like this with all of their businesses like this. And so a monopoly is one owner of all of these businesses. John D. Rockefeller recognizes, though, that with our anti-monopoly laws that are being considered, being sole owner of all of these oil companies could get dicey. And so what he's going to do is he's going to create another layer in between himself and his businesses. And so he is going to create a brand new thing that is going to be called the Standard Oil Trust. This is a trust company, and so what this company is going to have is it's going to have a board of trustees. So it's going to have a board of directors, and it's their job to manage the company. And what Rockefeller is going to do is he's going to give all of these trustees over here, he's going to give them the legal ownership of all of these companies. Now, technically, John D. Rockefeller is no longer the owner of all these companies. He is now just the owner of the Standard Oil Company. But then he's also going to give stock to these people too. And he's also going to sell stock on the stock market. And so by building this trust company, what he's going to do is he's going to build a layer in of complexity so that if somebody creates a law that says that it is against the law for one man to own all of the businesses in a certain industry, Rockefeller will be able to say, cool, I think we should get rid of those things too. I don't have that. I instead have something different, which is called a trust company. Eventually, he's going to turn that into something bigger, and he's going to turn that into something new called a holding company, where he's going to have trusts, and they will be part of this holding company that also owns other trusts. And so you're going to see that this very complicated mixture emerges where a bunch of people are going to figure out what the laws are, especially since they helped to write them. And they're going to figure out how to create anti-monopoly laws that look good to civilians, but do absolutely nothing, because as we start adding in trusts and holding companies and interlocking directorates, it's just going to get messier and messier. and most civilians won't be able to keep up, and most politicians are being paid, so they won't be trying to keep up. But eventually what's going to happen is we're going to create an environment that is totally set for monopolies to boom. Like we're going to create Standard Oil that is going to get massively into the oil business, and it's going to eventually expand not just here in America, but also into other parts of the world, into the Middle East and other sorts of countries, and it'll become the main oil producer for the world by the time we move into the early 1900s. The monopoly owner I'd like to highlight for you guys, though, is J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan is going to be vitally important for us as we look at multiple chapters, starting with the one that we just wrapped up with. J.P. Morgan is going to try to create monopolies not in oil or in steel. J.P. Morgan starts off with a monopoly in banking. He is America's banker in the late 1800s. What J.P. Morgan is nervous about is he feels that competition in America is bad. And what he believes is competition causes really good business owners, what he would call captains of industry, to waste their time competing against each other instead of creating something in their businesses that makes the business environment better. And so what he's going to do is he's going to be famous for creating what's known as interlocking directorates. And so if we bounce back to the little slide that I had built up for you here, in this board of trustees that you see right here, in the interlocking directorates, this guy that I'm highlighting right here, this guy might be part of the Standard Oil Trust, but he might also have a seat on the board of trustees for like steel and also a major railroad. This guy might do the same thing. This guy might also do the same thing. So eventually what's going to happen is J.P. Morgan is going to be pushing so much towards efficiency and a lack of competition that about the same few dozen people in the United States are going to end up owning most of the monopolies inside of our country, and they're going to have a huge amount of influence over the government and the decisions that they're making. So for very much the people who are nervous about laissez-faire economics, they're going to be people in the country who believe that the business owners aren't looking out for the common good or for the people, but instead they're going to see a corrupt system where they're able to rig the branches of government. They've got society wrapped up in their tentacles, and there's really no way to challenge them because they're more powerful than any politicians because they control so many of them. So when you read about attempts in the late 1800s to challenge the system, either with labor unions or anarchism, which is the idea of getting rid of all government, or socialism or communism, the idea that the government should take over some of these businesses and either regulate them some or run them totally, the reason why these ideas are catching momentum is because of the fact that we've gone the opposite direction. The businesses are thoroughly in control in the late 1800s, and nobody's challenging them. For steel, steel is massively important. So you want to know the term the Bessemer process, because the Bessemer process is going to allow us to mass produce steel for the first time ever. For a long time, steel was very hard to produce. It would take a lot of pounding and refining, but when they discovered this process to mass produce huge amounts of it, steel's more durable than iron. So steel is going to become the major source of materials that people want to use for railroads or factories or skyscrapers. And when America starts making massive amounts of this is going to make America powerful. When they can move it around the country using their trains and then with steamships be able to ship it over across the world, this is going to make America incredibly wealthy. And so while we look at what the captains of industry are doing in the late 1800s, and some will refer to them as robber barons, there are obviously abuses that are taking place, but we can't deny the fact that there's also a huge amount of wealth being created for the United States as a result of these guys. For Andrew Carnegie, though, he is going to be creating a massive amount of the steel inside the United States, creating it in Pittsburgh. So when you read about the Pittsburgh Steelers in the NFL, that's the reason why they're nicknamed the way that he is. And he is going to be very much somebody who tries to create his vertical monopoly system. For Andrew Carnegie, he is going to be then working with J.P. Morgan eventually. So J.P. Morgan is going to decide that he wants to buy U.S. Steel from Andrew Carnegie. The famous story about this is that J.P. Morgan had so much money in the late 1800s that he decided to buy Andrew Carnegie's steel mill system because of the fact that Carnegie was getting old. So he sent a man over to Carnegie's house, asked him what his sell price would be. Carnegie's sell price was above the number of $400 million. And so Carnegie agreed to sell his company for more than $400 million Plus, he was given $1 million salary that he could use however he wanted to. Even though he was not on the business side, he was still being paid a salary by J.P. Morgan for his company. And so he ended up a very wealthy man. Keep in mind that this is the same time period that J.P. Morgan bailed out the United States government during Grover Cleveland's presidency during the Panic of 1893 to the tune of about $100 million. So U.S. Steel is worth about 4 times what the entire United States budget and government was supposed to be. Now, later on, Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan found themselves on a boat with one another on a cruise. And J.P. Morgan, famously, when he sat down to Carnegie, started a conversation, and Carnegie said, I should have asked for more money. And supposedly J.P. Morgan looked back and said, I would have paid whatever number you put down on that sheet of paper because I thought it was worth it. And so for these guys, they're moving at a very different speed than the rest of society was. And so there's a huge amount of money that's spreading out. Now, for Carnegie, he is somebody who believes in something known as the gospel of wealth. So when you see this down here, you want to label that as being the gospel of wealth. Now, the gospel of wealth is Carnegie's idea that if you are rich, he believed in social Darwinism. He believed that the rich are rich because they're genetically better than poor people. For Carnegie, he didn't believe then that rich people should give their money to their kids because if their kids are destined to be rich, they should then be able to earn that money themselves. So what Carnegie believed is that he felt that we should create ladders of prosperity for poor people to be able to move up in society. He's famous for building things like the Carnegie Library. So if you ever travel around Minneapolis or the rest of the state, you'll find tons of libraries that Andrew Carnegie built, especially because of the Iron Range that we have up north. But with these libraries, he would build the library, not fill them with books. And his feeling was that if your town was not smart enough to fill up that library with books, then you guys don't really deserve to become rich someday. He felt the same way about like Carnegie Hall and universities and other sorts of things, where if you said, I don't want to go to the opera, I think that's for stupid people, Carnegie in the back of his mind would think, well, social Darwinism, you probably then are destined to end up poor because you don't understand that this is where rich people congregate and this is where they are going to be mingling, and you should be there too if you want to end up being some of them. For J.P. Morgan, though, what he is going to do is he is going to make U.S. Steel even bigger. And so it becomes our first billion-dollar company. So now J.P. Morgan is not just owning a monopoly in banking. He now also owns a monopoly in steel. And that's what I want you to notice is Morgan is the least notable of your people in the book. Most kids gravitate towards Carnegie and Rockefeller. Morgan is the guy moving at a fast speed, though, when he's trying to build up monopolies. And he becomes a huge target when we get to the early 1900s, because he is our last huge monopoly that is really stretching bigger and bigger. When it comes to oil, though, this is where Rockefeller comes in. And with Rockefeller, what I want you to notice is he is producing oil to create kerosene, which is going to light lamps inside of people's homes to try to replace the whale oil that we've been using previously. For Rockefeller's kerosene, his goal is that he is going to try to figure out ways to take this oil and use it inside the United States to try to create light. And then once Edison's light bulb comes into vogue, we're going to find that with internal combustion engines, like in factories and in automobiles, Rockefeller will hit gold twice by having his oil have a second use. For Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, though, what he is looking to do is he is trying to figure out how he also can get rid of middlemen and get rid of competition. But he's going to do that strictly in the level of selling oil and refining oil, not by buying the oil rigs themselves. What Rockefeller will do also is he is cutthroat in his competition. He will go to his competitors and he will offer them the opportunity to sell, but if they do not sell, he will then go into their market, underprice his oils to the point where he's actually losing money on his oil in that market, but eventually he'll drive his competitors out of business and they will then have to give up their company in bankruptcy. When you look at what he's doing, though, many times Rockefeller would just come in and say to business owners, hey, if you want to, I'll buy your company. I'll give you, instead of money, I'll give you stock ownership in my company. And there are many business owners inside the country who voluntarily gave up their company in competition to become part of the largest company in the United States that's selling oil. So for Rockefeller, he is going to be hugely influential in the late 1800s, and he has no problem being cutthroat in building up efficiency. He's famous for one story where he found out that cans were being made inside of his factory using metal and solder. And with that metal and solder, he asked the question, why are we using the amounts that we use? And their answer was, we don't know. We've just always done it this way. He discovered he could make his cans with one less piece of solder, and that ended up saving him thousands of dollars over the lifetime of his company. And so he was that nitpicky about efficiency, and he'll do the same when it comes to government. He has no problem trying to work politicians to get better rules for himself so that his company is then taken care of. You're going to find that Rockefeller, though, is going to be very much in battle with other monopoly owners. He is very much building up his company, and he's very much concerned about his company, his shareholders, and all of that stuff, rather than being worried about America in general. And what he's going to do is he's going to start figuring out how to become more and more efficient, and that's going to allow him to be able to build up his company. Now, what I want you to notice, though, is the American Beauty rose that is being discussed here, because this is the metaphor that Rockefeller used to explain why you shouldn't have problems with monopolies. He was a rose grower, and what he said is if you are ever in a competition to grow a prized rose, you don't allow a rose bush to kick out all of these blooms all over the place, because each of those blooms conserves energy. He said instead, you pick out the bloom that is the best, that will win at the show for you, and you pluck off every other rose, and you just feed and nurture that one rose and let it bloom into the winner of the competition. Rockefeller saw Standard Oil as that beautiful rose, and so he felt that taking out the other oil companies wasn't just something he should do, but it's something that the country should embrace, because he would then be able to create really cheap, high-quality oil that everybody could rely on. Our problem, though, is in the late 1800s, then, we've got one person providing our steel, one person providing our oil, one person providing our banking, a group of people providing our railroads, and if they decide that they don't want to take care of the common interest, then you're kind of out of luck, because they're the ones who have built up these monopolies. And there's other monopolies in stuff like sugar, tobacco, leather. We're going to find that the McCormick Reaper Company, the Harvester Trust, is going to have a bunch of companies all under one heading, where if you want to buy a Reaper, it's going to cost you this much money, because they're all pooling together to figure out what rates they're going to charge you. There is no competition. If you're selling meat inside the country, these are the two men who are doing that. And as a result, they can do what they want to do, and nobody can block them. These guys also become so rich that they are able to push past the traditional old money families, and they're the ones who are able to move into becoming the elites inside of our society. And many of them are not really all that concerned about anything other than protecting where they are, because, again, they've bought into the idea of social Darwinism. They believe that social Darwinism is true, and they believe that they're the living examples of what social Darwinism is. Now, this cartoon showed up on the AP test a couple of years ago, and so if you look at this, these are your monopolies. Most notably, you've got Vanderbilt right here. You've got Jay Gould up here. You'll notice that they are building their empire on top of all of these poor people who are struggling to hold these guys afloat. And you'll notice that these waters right here can rise and swamp all of these people, but on their backs, these guys will never feel an economic crash or a decline, because they're being taken care of. So many of these people are embracing the idea that their wealth is built on the idea of social Darwinism, that they are genetically better than poor people and they deserve their money. Some of the rich people believe in what Carnegie's talking about, the gospel of wealth, where if you're rich, you should donate your money to figure out ways to use that money well. The idea is that if rich people have a lot of money, they're the best ones to invest the money to help poor people out. Many of these individuals do not believe that the government should be helping out with poor people, because they see what the government is. The government is corrupt. It's wasteful. If they get money, they do stuff like the Credit Mobilier, largely because these guys could buy them at a moment's notice and get them to do whatever the heck they want to. The problem that we're going to find is that there is going to be some money given by these guys to charity, but it's going to be charity like building libraries, universities, and when the economy crashes, oftentimes these guys will benefit from the crash without much concern about what's happening to the workers. We're going to see then that this embrace of evolution by rich people is going to be coming from the idea that they can then apply this to human beings, and then this takes any sort of sympathy away from the views of what poor people are up to. The feeling that a poor person is struggling, in rich people's minds, it's going to be because they're lazy, they're stupid, they're from poor genetic stock, and so they're kind of getting what they deserve. We're going to find then that a lot of these rich individuals will then start creating a wealth of educational materials to back up the idea that they are on the right side of society. They'll have speakers who travel around the country with rags to riches stories, talking about how being rich is a blessing from God. Many of the people are also going to highlight the idea that inside the Constitution, Congress is the only one who can actually engage in interstate regulations. And many of the businesses in the late 1800s are going to argue that they are protected by the 14th Amendment. And so during the re-election campaign of Barack Obama, we had a comment made by Mitt Romney where he said to a journalist, "Corporations are people, my friend." And what he said was legally true according to the American Legal Code, but it sounded awkward when he said it, because in the late 1800s, many monopolies are going to argue that the 14th Amendment, saying that if you're born in the country, you have certain rights as a citizen, many of them wanted to have that applied to businesses as well, claiming that businesses being owned by private citizens should then have rights kind of like a private citizen should have. And so you're going to find that the ability to regulate businesses are going to be really hamstrung because the courts and Congress are largely being influenced by our businesses. We're going to find then that this is going to stop our regulation process. And for many business owners, they're going to realize some states like the Midwest are passing Granger laws to try to break down monopolies. Others don't. And so many businesses start moving to states where they are very much not into doing regulations. And the most famous of those is going to be New Jersey, where many different businesses will set up their headquarters in New Jersey, or just a dummy headquarters, so that they could then claim that there is no ability to regulate them because the state itself isn't interested in doing any of that stuff. We are going to see, though, that people are going to be angry about this who are not in the upper crust of society. So there are going to be some people who try to figure out ways to roll back monopolies and trusts through the state legislatures, but after the Wabash court cases, they're going to eventually go to Congress and demand the creation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The problem, though, is the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to say that it's illegal to form a combination that restrain trade, but they're not going to define what that looks like, and so they're going to leave that up to the courts. What they're also going to not say is they're not going to say if there are things as good trust or bad trust. They're just going to say that if a company takes over 100% ownership of a branch of business, then that business is a monopoly that needs to be broken up. We're going to find, though, this law is a thorough mess. There is a court case called E.G. Knight versus the United States. It was a sugar monopoly court case, and in the sugar monopoly, they own like 98% of the sugar production inside the United States. But since they didn't own 100%, that law didn't apply to them. In fact, the only time the Sherman Antitrust Act was used in the 1800s was used to break up a monopoly, claiming that, used to break up a union, because the union, it was claimed, was stopping trade during a strike, and so they were the ones who were engaging in restraint of trade by forming a combination. So we're going to see that this law, while it's a nice first step for reformers, it has virtually no power to do anything because it's largely being written by politicians who are being told by the trust owners themselves what should be written, and they create gigantic loopholes they can then jump through. We're going to find, though, that this is your beginning of a reform movement inside the country that is going to start pushing towards change. What I want you to notice, though, is inside this chapter, you're going to find that the South is going to be engaged in trying to figure out ways to manufacture as well. But many people in the South are going to stay bound up in the sharecropping wage system that they had in the past, and it's going to be very hard for them to industrialize. What they're also going to run into problems with is they're going to run into problems with competition, because northern monopolies will actually work with the government to set up rules to make it harder for the South to industrialize. For the South, though, they will start creating new products to try to create their own businesses. One of the most famous ones is going to be the tobacco industry. So if you notice Duke Tobacco, they're going to start creating cigarettes that are already pre-rolled. And this company is going to then eventually lead to a lot of investment in North Carolina that eventually leads to like Duke University and other sorts of institutions that benefit from Duke doing in the South what Carnegie's been doing in the North. We're going to find, though, that in the South, they are very much overwhelmingly rural, but there is a push to create a new South to try to figure out ways to industrialize. We're going to find that the northern railroads, though, will work with northern monopolies to set up a rate system for the South, where southern railroads will actually overcharge southern factories, so it's harder for them to compete with northern factories. So we're not just shutting down competition with foreign countries, but also the South is getting punished as well. We're going to find that this is especially seen in the Pittsburgh Plus pricing system in the steel industry, where they're going to figure out what price Pittsburgh is being charged for transportation, and they're going to charge southern steel mills more in order to keep them down. The thing for the South, though, is inside the South, that Southern mentality of states' rights and limited government and nativism is going to make them incredibly attractive going in the future. So please notice these items on the bottom of the page down here. In the South, you have a bunch of white and African American workers who are incredibly cheap to pay. That is going to become incredibly attractive for factory owners as we move into the 1900s. Secondarily, many Southerners believe that anarchism, socialism, communism are all un-American, and they feel the same way about labor unions. So in the Deep South, many white Southerners are going to be anti-union, and that is also going to become very appealing for these northern factories. When northern factories start realizing that in the South, you've got a new South that's trying to industrialize with workers who are willing to accept working conditions that northern workers will not, especially with unionization, you're going to see a huge movement in factories once we get to the early 20th century, and that's coming up very soon. As we look at the South, though, the South is going to find themselves being left behind. And so where there are mill towns that are being built up, especially to try to build up textiles, you're going to find that these places are going to find that they're falling further and further behind. And many of the people who are working inside these factory towns are essentially find themselves trapped in wage slavery, where many of these workers are trapped in company towns where they are working in a place where the company owns not just the factory, but also the housing and the stores. Many of these people are not being paid in money, but they're being paid in something called scrip, S-C-R-I-P. So when they want to spend this company money, they have to spend it at the company store where everything is overpriced. And so many of these workers are going to see that they're being very much kept as second-class citizens in these factories that are not being very nice to them. So workers in the South and the North in the factories are having some struggles. We're also going to find that there are struggles popping up for others inside of our society too, and this is where we're going to be taking a look at the rest of our documentary that I've got laid out for you, and so here we go.
Despite advances in industry, agriculture remained America's basic occupation. Like the revolution in industry, the switch from hand labor to mechanized labor marked the revolution in agriculture. By 1870, the reaper, thresher, steel plow, and combine had encouraged farming in the rugged prairies west of the Mississippi. To feed the growing population, settlers pushed west to cultivate new lands, due in part to the Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act promoted the settlement of publicly owned lands in the Great Plains in either of two ways. For a $10 fee, land was given in 160-acre parcels to anyone who would live on or farm the land for 5 years. Or settlers could buy the land outright for $1.25 per acre. By 1870, migrants flowed west from Kentucky, Missouri, and Illinois at the rate of over 5,000 wagons per month. But crop yields were low to the 500,000 families who claimed homestead land due to light rainfall and arid conditions. In response to this hardship, a new method called dry farming was developed, which required that the fields be left fallow every other year. This allowed the dry soil to store up moisture and nutrients for the following year's crop. These frontier farmers discovered that wheat was an ideal crop for dry farming, and by 1900, the plains had become one of the greatest wheat-producing regions in the world. But farmers faced many hardships. For pioneer farmers, neighbors were few, water was scarce, and families faced brutal winter blizzards and intense summer heat. The dreaded summer dust storm might erase a season's labor, and swarms of locusts could wipe out entire crops. In some treeless plains areas, Families lived in houses made of sod or Nebraska marble to insulate themselves against the extreme changes in temperature. Between 1860 and 1890, the nation's population more than doubled, but the American farmer rose to the challenge, growing enough grain, cotton, and corn, and raising enough beef and pork to not only supply the growing population, but to create a surplus as well. By 1890, the first successful gasoline-powered tractors were in use, enabling farmers to meet urban demand. Each successful farm produced enough food to feed 5 people in 1850. 40 years later, those same farms could feed 15 people, largely through the use of more sophisticated and modern equipment. Along with these conveniences came problems unique to modern development. By 1890, overproduction had begun to occur, leading to a glut of produce on the world market. Inevitably, prices plummeted. With increasing demand, shipping rates were steadily rising, and by 1877, it took fully half of gross sales to pay the exorbitant freight charges. Overwhelmed by this predicament, 80% of homestead farms failed by 1900. Most never completed their 5-year residency requirement. While farming drew people to the prairies and plains, mining beckoned them even further west. By horseback or rail, prospectors converged on the mountainous countryside, seeking their fortunes in silver and gold. Overnight, makeshift homes and tents would spring up along hillsides in the great wilderness. These settlements were the forerunners of cities such as Boise, Idaho, and Denver, Colorado. It was a rough and dangerous existence. Bandits roamed the roads, seeking the precious metal at the owner's expense. Vigilante law was established in many western towns where the rope and gun ruled. While mining made some rich, most prospectors managed only a meager living from the rapidly disappearing pockets of precious minerals. Nearly 4 million longhorn steer roamed the Texas plains in 1860. As demand for beef grew in faraway cities such as Chicago, St. Louis, and Philadelphia, the challenge was created to move large herds toward the cities. In 1867, Joseph G. McCoy built a cattle trading station in Kansas near the railroad. McCoy recruited cowboys to drive herds, and within 5 months, 25,000 longhorn had arrived. Several other cattle trails snaked their way to Kansas in a remarkably short time. Farmland along these trails was often trampled by the steer, and the homesteaders reacted bitterly to the haphazard destruction of their cultivated lands. As railways began to crisscross the country in the 1880s, the demand fell for cowboys to relocate Texas herds. By the 1890s, the peak of the cowboy era had come to an end. The American Industrial Revolution was marked not only by the changing face of American industry, but also by the changing face of America. As mills and factories sprouted across the land, cities grew up around them. In turn, the cities beckoned to workers by the millions from the American countryside and from overseas to fuel the burgeoning industrialization. What was once a rural nation was rapidly becoming an urban state. Between 1860 and 1910, the urban population grew from 6 million to over 44 million. Rural Americans abandoned their farms to take factory jobs in the big cities. Joining them en masse were new immigrants from overseas. By 1870, they were arriving on American shores at a rate of nearly 400,000 per year. By 1882, this number had doubled to 800,000 annually. This tide of urban migration brought with it new social problems. Until 1885, most immigrants were from Northern Europe and Britain. But by the late 1880s, people from Southern and Eastern Europe and Latin America began to disembark from the transcontinental steamships, creating racial and ethnic tensions. Due to increased cultural diversity, the scope of social problems began to grow. These were the landless, the unskilled, and poverty-stricken. The huddled masses that Emma Lazarus reflected upon in her poignant inscription for the Statue of Liberty.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
The growth of American urban centers was nothing short of astounding. In the 20 years after 1870, the population of Minneapolis grew from 13,000 to 165,000. Denver grew from 4,700 to 107,000. And New York had a population of over 2 million. Chicago and Philadelphia had more than 1 million citizens each, and Baltimore, Boston, and St. Louis were home to nearly 500,000 people. Housing, water, and crucial services such as sanitation, roads, and bridges were woefully inadequate. New tenements sprung up and were immediately overcrowded. Garbage collection efforts and police and fire protection simply could not meet the overwhelming demand from city dwellers. Journalist H.L. Mencken described the stench of 1880s Baltimore like 1 billion polecats. Widespread corruption in the cities was blamed on the immigrants who crowded dilapidated buildings, packed the jails, and voted for the candidates of powerful politicians in return for small favors. In 1900, a local journalist marveled at the capacity people displayed to survive in deplorable conditions. The wonder is that they are not all corrupted, and speedily, by their surroundings. 19th century sociologist William Graham Sumner held the controversial belief that the fittest members adapt to the environment and prosper, while weaker members do not. For the social Darwinist, these principles of natural selection applied to capitalism. The more prevalent view, championed by the wealthy, including John D. Rockefeller, was that the power to make money is a gift from God. Modern America rose from the foundations laid by men such as Rockefeller, and history views them kindly for their contributions. But despite their wealth, they were often reluctant to share the good fortune with their employees. Employees often worked 12 to 18-hour days. Factories were dark, dirty, and dangerous. Working conditions in many factories were shocking. One Massachusetts textile worker compared the animosity between worker and employer to the former feeling of bitterness between the North and the South. While business tycoons risked huge amounts of money to gamble on technological advances and new markets, they were unwilling to share profits with their workers. Their words reflect the expectations of one Massachusetts employer. I regard my work people just as I regard my machines. When my machines get old and useless, I replace them. It's the same with these people. As long as they do the work for what I choose to pay, I get out of them what I can. Many factory machines were run by women and children, some as young as 8 years old. These children, who were paid less than adults, were forced to work the same long hours. This was a typical factory workday for children in the textile factories around 1870. Many families depended on the small incomes of their young children to survive in America. These are the words of Sadie Frown, a 16-year-old sweatshop girl.
Those machines run like mad all day long. Sometimes my finger gets caught, then the needle goes through it. If it goes through the nail, too, it hurts real bad. But I just tie a rag around it and keep on sewing. Sometimes the finger has to come off. Y'all have accidents like that.
If workers complained, they were quickly replaced with other immigrants eager for the work. These conditions planted the seeds for labor reform. The skilled workers, cigar makers, printers, and iron workers began to organize in 1875. Soon after, factory workers also began to unite. They sought to get equal pay for women and shorter workdays. By the end of the decade, union membership reached 300,000. In 1877, pay cuts totaling 20% caused Baltimore and Ohio rail workers to strike. Two-thirds of the nation's rail service was affected. 10 workers in Baltimore were killed in the resulting riots. Another 26 in Pittsburgh died, prompting President Rutherford B. Hayes to call out federal troops, thus ending the strike. These events led to the formation of the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, led by Terence Powderly. This organization worked to improve adverse sweatshop and factory conditions and to outlaw child labor. The Knights were at odds with the more conservative American Federation of Labor, a movement headed by Samuel Gompers. Gompers emerged as leader of labor reform, leading the AFL from 1886 until his death in 1924. By 1900, laws were being passed to improve housing conditions, health, and education for the poor. Before the mid-19th century, America had a seemingly endless supply of natural resources, including timber, minerals, and wildlife. Throughout much of the country's history, pollution was not a major problem. But the Industrial Revolution upset the balance between man and nature. For decades, waste from factories was dumped haphazardly into lakes, rivers, and streams. Pollution from the mainstream use of factory machinery and motor-driven vehicles had an adverse impact on the atmosphere. By 1870, the devastating consequence to natural and animal resources spurred the formation of wildlife organizations dedicated to reversing this dangerous trend. Wide-scale, careless environmental pollution became an issue vigorously debated in political circles. By 1880, modern conservationists who had become organized to champion the movement lobbied congressmen and state legislators. In response, by 1890, Congress had set aside millions of acres of land across the U.S. to preserve resources. Huge expanses of terrain were set aside as national parks and habitats. Prior to the end of his term, President Grover Cleveland created new forest reserves totaling 20 million acres in 1897. In 1888, the Boone and Crockett Club, a sportsmen's conservation organization, was formed by Theodore Roosevelt. In 1891, the Forest Reserve Act gave the president the authority to set aside public lands marked by forests. 27 men founded the Sierra Club in 1892, with John Muir as its president. Water pollution was addressed in 1899 when the Rivers and Harbors Act prohibited the dumping of waste in the nation's harbors, canals, and waterways. The turn of the century symbolized the end of the old America. The former rural country, grounded in agriculture and hand-worked goods, had become an urbanized industrial Goliath. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad had at long last fulfilled the march of manifest destiny. New industries set the stage for future growth, and the new Colossus had seen a native population become a land of immigrants. Revolutionary changes achieved at a revolutionary pace. As the 19th century faded, the nation, having survived its struggle for independence, the ravages of a civil war, and the impact of an era, stood poised on the brink of a new century. Much remained to be done, but the foundation had been laid. America was now strong enough to face the unique challenges the 20th century would bring.
The remainder of your lecture today is very much focused on what you've just heard from the video that we just wrapped up. And so let's get into what we see going on with the late 1800s. And let me give you two terms that you want to be able to use. For people who are sympathetic to the business owners of this time period, they will refer to them as being captains of industry, choosing to highlight the fact that they are going to create a lot of wealth, jobs, innovations, advances that we'll see inside of our country. And so there are many people who will argue that what you see happen in the late 1800s is a good thing that took place. In spite of the abuses that happened, overwhelmingly they'll see that as a net positive. And as a result, when you look at our debates that we have currently inside of our politics, there are a group of people who are very much more conservative in their views, who believe that we should do things like lower taxes, deregulate, embrace business owners as job creators, and to do things to try to make a conducive environment to help them to be able to run their businesses. Many people will then also be able to highlight the fact that we do see standards of living going up for many people inside of our country, and many immigrants choose to come to America because this is a place where they can find opportunities that are different than what they find back in their home country. We're going to find also cities boom during this time period, but we're also going to see that at this time period, there is a movement towards responding to the people who would refer to our monopoly owners not as captains of industry, but as robber barons. There's going to be an argument that many people have that the government has gone too far in allowing businesses to run as they want to. And there's a feeling that there should be limits, rules, and regulations that are put on to make sure the monopolies are not abusing the powers that they have. You can see that this issue is dividing the Republican Party in the late 1800s when they divide up into mugwumps, stalwarts, and half-breeds, especially when it comes over the issue of reform after Garfield's assassination. And so that's going to be something that plays out in our next few chapters. We're going to find, though, that inside of our economy, the northern part of the United States is going to massively industrialize. The South will gradually start moving in that direction, and the West is very much used as a storehouse for natural resources that are then being used by multiple railroads to fill the factories in the East, and then they're serving as a market to be able to buy the stuff that's being produced by the factories. The factories are also selling stuff this direction, but they're also transferring stuff on the railroad to the West Coast, where it can then be transferred over to Asia. We're going to see that during this time period, we're going to have very different situations for different groups of women. Some women are going to find themselves being impacted by the new inventions that they have. And so if you remember when we talked about the cult of domesticity, there are some middle to upper income women who are typically white, who are inside of homes engaged in the cult of domesticity, raising families in a traditional sort of sense. And so they're very much seeing this era as a boom when it comes to the changes that are happening. But many of these women are joining reform organizations like we talked about in class, whether it's the Women's Christian Temperance Unions or suffrage or whatever. Many women who are working, though, are working because they're from poor families. And so we're going to find that women are working inside of businesses, and what they're going to face is they're going to face discrimination, where they're going to be working the same number of hours, but they're going to be making less cash, because many business owners will label what they're doing as women's jobs, and they'll believe that they should pay men more because they're the breadwinners of a family. What we're going to find, though, is throughout the course of this class, when we move through the late 1800s, this will then be used to really hurt poor people in the Panic of 1893, because as a result of this, many women will be continued in employment when men will get laid off, because they'll be cheaper to keep in the job market. And so we're going to see a lot of families suffer because while there's people employed, they're being underpaid because they can pay women differently than men are going to get paid. We're going to find that at this time, then, the difference between rich and poor is going to become accentuated, and we're going to see a gap that's going to be growing during this time. We're going to also see that these class divisions will create criticism. Some of it was people being envious. Some of them are talking about reforms that they could bring to stop this spread of class differences taking place. But we're going to find that 10% of Americans own 90% of the nation's wealth in 1900, which is a massive imbalance. And we're watching in our current world a similar sort of trend taking place, where we're watching the gap between rich and poor growing rather than decreasing currently. And it'll be a highlight that will be playing out as we move through the rest of the class. What I wanted to highlight for you, though, is when you looked at the end of the documentary I showed you with miners and ranchers and lumberjacks and farmers, you've got a huge chunk of Americans who are self-employed. Half of them are in 1860, but by 1900, we've got a shift taking place. Instead of being self-employed, 2/3 of Americans are going to be dependent on wages. What that means is if you are dependent on wages and the economy crashes, you've learned through your Steel Empire game that sometimes when the economy crashes, a business owner will lay off workers, cut wages, while also expanding the factory to make their monopoly bigger. You've now also seen that many of these self-employed people who are farmers, ranchers, miners, and whatever, they are very much dependent on the monopolies for railroads, who oftentimes will then start increasing rates when they have the opportunity to do so. And they'll also see that the gold standard is going to cause deflation to take place, where many of these individuals won't be able to get proper wages for the crops that they're producing. Many people are also pushing for more foreign trade, but what's happening is businesses are maintaining that high tariff, and so you're about to see a battle between tariffs and lower tariffs, high tariffs and low. One of the other elements you're about to see is imperialism. America is going to start conquering other countries because the feeling then becomes, if we're going to keep high tariffs, but we conquer a place like Hawaii and Hawaii becomes part of America, then a tariff doesn't apply to them. So one of the reasons why we start conquering other countries is there's a groundswell of people who want to take over other territories to get their resources, but then also to create another market that we can trade with inside the United States sphere. For workers, then, what we're going to find is that for the employers that we see during this time period, the workers are very much going to be seen as replaceable. They are very much depersonalized. The factories now don't have the factory owner working in them like the old-scale factories did. And so many of the factories are owned by people who are more concerned about stockholders rather than they're worried about their workers themselves. There are no rules for like minimum wages, safety rules, that sort of stuff. And so you have an us versus them mentality that starts growing inside the factories themselves. One of the phrases that I want you to think about also is that with work in the world, and this is what you will be experiencing, you will find that as you move out into the world for a business, prices are typically fluid, where very much a business will be quick to change the price of its goods based on if the economy is getting stronger or weaker. What you'll typically find, though, is while prices are fluid, wages are typically sticky, which means that a business owner will be very reluctant to raise wages until they absolutely get enough signals that it's the time to do so, and until they actually have pressure to do so. So while we crashed the economy in 2007, you'll notice that one of the current issues over the past year with the presidential election was the fact that wages haven't increased, even though the stock market keeps hitting record highs on a daily basis. So this is what we see happening in the late 1800s. A lot of these workers have very little influence, and they know that their wages aren't keeping up, and they know they're being replaced by machines, which is a current trend we're facing with automation in our current society. And there's a lot more workers than there are jobs because of all the immigrants that are swooping into the country during this time. And so for individual workers, they realize that a business has all the advantages. They could kick out individual workers. The employers could put together tons of money with their stockholders. They could purchase high-priced lawyers, and they can also influence politicians, and they could also influence the press to lead them to believe that any sort of attempts that you use to try to get better conditions is either socialism, communism, anarchism, or some other anti-American nativistic sort of element. And so for many of these workers, they're stuck. These are breaker boys. These are kids younger than you, and their job is to work inside of a coal mine all day long while coal and other rocks fall down here. And it's their job to reach down into a chute of moving rock that's moving fast and pick out the coal from the rock that they do not want to have inside their coal. These kids get hurt. They're immigrants. Nobody really cares about them, and so they're going to be having a lot of problems trying to get things changed. Now, on top of being able to put pressure on politicians, these people who are running businesses are also allowed to hire strike breakers or scabs. On the West Coast, these are Chinese people, and when the Chinese get hired to replace white workers, what the white workers are not going to realize is they have more in common with the Chinese workers than they do with the factory owners. And many of these workers will then get mad at the Chinese workers, and then the business owner will get off without much tension. We'll also find the same thing up in the north when it comes to like the Irish, and especially when it comes to African Americans, that they'll be used as scabs or strike breakers to take over jobs during a strike inside of a factory to then try to break the union. And then finally, what the business can do is they can employ thugs or even have the government judge, courts and judges, or even the military come and break up any sort of strikes they want to. And if they end up hurting or killing people, there really is no punishment with that. Businesses could lock out workers and give them no pay. And so as a result, these people will eventually go bankrupt until they have to come back with their tail between their legs. Or else they could be forced to sign yellow dog contracts, which says if you want to work inside this business, you're not allowed to start a union. And so every element that you see going on in this business is very much tuned to the idea that we're not just not regulating businesses. Laissez-faire is not just hands off. It is very much that it's a pro-business sort of philosophy where all the advantages are being given to factories to make sure they're as profitable and as productive as possible, because it will make America wealthy, and the politicians are benefiting as well. If you mess with a company, you can end up on a blacklist, and if you're blacklisted, you're never going to get a job inside that business ever again. And many workers are going to be finding themselves in trouble, because what the businesses will do is they love setting up a company store where they will force the workers to pay for stuff, and the company store's prices are outrageous, and so they're gonna very much be bankrupting the workers. So they're stuck in a system of perpetual debt. If this system sounds like sharecropping, it should. And so we're going to find that there are white people in the North and the South who should be getting along with each other, African Americans in the South with whites in the North. But we're going to find that in our society, the main huge thing that we're going to see rising in the late 1800s is this racist, nativistic sort of thing that's going to be happening, where for many Americans who could unite in the belief that there are things going wrong in their economy, they're going to be turned off to each other because they're going to see class differences and ethnic differences. For the middle class, many of them are doing great, and so many of them are going to believe the business owners when they say that the immigrants who are in unions are foreigners, they're socialistic, they're unpatriotic, they're terroristic, and the big businesses are very much going to be given the benefit of the doubt, while the workers are not. And especially given the fact that for a lot of middle class people, they realize if a union starts getting better wages, that means the price of everything will go up. And a lot of middle class people aren't excited about that. So you're going to see a very stark difference, both in the United States and overseas. So if you've ever read Charles Dickens with like the Christmas story, the Christmas Carol, you're going to find that that's very much the environment that you see happening here, where you've got a growing underclass of people who very much feel like they're being oppressed. And so there's a movement to start unionizing post-Civil War. You have several 100,000 by 1872 who are going to unionize. The first union is the National Labor Union, and they're going to be trying to figure out ways to hold together in their union efforts. They put together hundreds of thousands of people inside their union, but they're going to find that with this union, they're going to be struggling when it comes to racially a white and a colored National Labor Union. Notice the things they're asking for, though, and this is where I wanted to consider what's taking place inside these unions. What they're asking for at the time is seen as radical, crazy ideas, but all they're asking for is that if there's a dispute between business and workers, that they bring in an arbitrator so that there's a mediator between them to discuss, and they want an 8-hour workday. When they get to the Panic of 1873, this union is going to fall apart because they really can't maintain the union through the crash, since it's so easy for everybody to get workers who are not unionized. Your most important union after the National Labor Union that we see happening here is going to be the Knights of Labor, and this one you have to know specifically. The Knights of Labor is going to be a union that wants to create one gigantic union, skilled and unskilled, white and African American, men and women, and they very much are only about being anti to these individuals who they see as not really being productive inside of our society. What they want to do is they want to create not just better business situations, but they also want to reform our society, because they're very much nervous about what's happening with businesses, and they see that the businesses are rigging the system so that they're getting payouts from the government while the workers are getting very much less. Notice the name Terence Powderly. He is going to be the guy who's leading the Knights of Labor, and they're going to be very much successful in getting some accommodations, where they start getting the 8-hour workday, they start getting some recognition, they get very large, but then they're going to fall apart in 1886. During the Panic of 1883, the Knights of Labor had a strike in Chicago. It led to a bomb being thrown at police officers, and 8 anarchists are going to be arrested as a result of engaging in this strike. When you have anarchists as part of the union, the propaganda for this is going to be extreme. And so for many people in America, they're fearful that the unions are filled with anarchists, socialists, communists, radicals who are un-American. And we're going to find that this is going to be very detrimental for the Knights of Labor. When the Knights of Labor disappear, then, we're going to find that this union is going to start falling apart, especially given the fact that with skilled workers, it's hard to replace them. But trying to mix a skilled and unskilled worker union is difficult because the unskilled workers could easily be replaced by scabs because they're very much not all that special with any sort of skills they have. So many of these individuals start thinking about creating a new union that is just for skilled individuals because they are very much harder to replace, and so they can negotiate a little bit easier. This is going to lead to then the creation of the American Federation of Labor that's going to replace the Knights of Labor. The American Federation of Labor is led by Samuel Gompers. This is going to be a group of unions working with one another. And inside this union, what they're trying to do is they're trying to not be radical. They are not fans of socialism. They are very much not going to try to break down capitalism. And what he says is he wants to push for bread and butter issues, better wages, hours, and working conditions. And they're going to try to avoid strikes when it's possible. So for the Knights of Labor, they get the reputation for being radical, and they're not around anymore. The AFL is seen as the more mainstream union. They're still around nowadays as part of the AFL-CIO. One of the things that they're pushing for, though, is trying to get agreements with businesses to create a closed shop so that if you're running a business and the AFL is there, you have to join the AFL to be working inside the factory. But then the AFL is going to try to figure out ways to work with the business owners to try to create a solid workforce, but then also get accommodations from the business owners themselves. We're going to find that this union will survive the Panic of 1893, but we're going to see massive numbers of strikes, especially with the Panic of 1893, because the Panic of 1893 takes a bunch of middle-class people who had been successful, it crashes them out, and it's really going to do damage to the Gilded Age mentality of social Darwinism, because a bunch of workers who once had jobs now don't have jobs. Or they're forced into jobs like this where they believe they were genetically special, and now they realize they're not. And so you have millions of workers striking, costing millions of dollars. And this is during Cleveland's presidency when Grover Cleveland is supposed to be a reformer, but he's going to work to crush this union as well. We're going to find, though, in the late 1800s, the Panic of 1893, more and more people are going to recognize that when a crash happens, if a business is working to reduce the wages of workers who have already been crashed out by the economy, those people are never winning. And so there's a movement towards the idea that workers should be able to organize, form unions, collectively bargain, where they all go to the boss at the same time and ask for a raise. The right to strike is largely recognized by Americans at that point. Labor Day becomes a national holiday created by the unions to recognize the union efforts. And many of the industrialists during this time period are going to find that it's not a bad idea to try to figure out how to avoid the strikes, but the vast majority of businesses do not like organized labor still at this point because they feel like the unions are bringing in a power swing that could lead to reform efforts that will then derail the Gilded Age. So we're about to find that as we get to 1900, the situation is set where we've now built up this huge group of people, African Americans in the North and the South, white farmers and ranchers and miners and lumberjacks, factory workers, and white sharecroppers in the Deep South. You've got all of these groups together that have grievances with the way that the country is running, and those grievances get worse with the Panic of 1893. And more, there's a feeling that there's a trend that we should take away from laissez-faire and towards reform, which will be known as the Progressive Era. This is your modern politics, though, because there's still a solid chunk of Americans at this time who are middle to upper income, who are very much resistant to the idea of changing because things have been just fine, and they have no concerns about the direction that America is going. And so as a result, this will now become our ongoing discussion. It's less about slavery and more about economics and politics and the role in that. So this is the end of your lecture. Obviously, this is very long, and so for you guys, if there's stuff that you need to have recovered or discussed, feel free to let me know. But otherwise, I'll be posting the Chapter 25 lecture shortly, so you're able to take a look at that. And a solid chunk of Chapter 25 is literature, artistic movements, and whatever that we can really de-emphasize, and you'll find that should be a shorter lecture as a result. Thanks a lot. Hopefully your studies go well, and hopefully your break is too.